welcome everyone, and welcome to episode 33 of In Conversation with Convergence. My name is George Evans, and as many of you, our listeners, know, we meet with clients each and every month and talk about some of the top issues facing the industry. I'm joined by two great guests today, Lou Crasto and Alex Bradford. Lou is a co-leader of RSM's fund services business, kind of newly formed fund services business, right? And Alex, I believe, Alex, you did a stint at RSM, went to the SEC, and you're back at RSM, if I read that correctly. So Alex is a partner at RSM. So, gentlemen, welcome. I want to thank you both for making time for the conversation today. It's great to have you. And I thought we could start with, I'm always impressed with people's pedigrees and what they've done prior to their current role. And I thought each of you could just tell our listeners a little bit about kind of your background. So maybe, Alex, we could start with you.
Yeah, happy to. And thanks so much for the invite. I'm glad to be here. Like you mentioned, George, I'm Alex Bradford. I'm an insurance partner based out of DC at RSM. I kind of focus on registered funds, RICs, BDCs, as well as alternative funds, primarily private equity, private credit, and venture capital. And like you mentioned, I'm a recovering regulator. I just recently wrapped up a nearly 3-year stint at the SEC. I was serving as the assistant chief accountant in the Division of Investment Management. And so while I was at the commission, I really was really fortunate to wear a number of hats, right? So I got to see a lot of what goes on behind the scenes, interact with a lot of folks at the SEC, as well as a lot of registrants. So I worked on technical accounting consultations. I reviewed complex registration statements. I assisted the Division of Exams and Enforcements in executing their various exam and enforcement programs. I consulted on, and in a few cases put pen to paper on some recent rulemakings coming out of the SEC. So I got to do a lot, see a lot. It was a great experience, great fellowship program there at the SEC. But it's nice to be on the other side of the table and just kind of get to talk about some of the stuff I worked on while I was on staff.
And if I have this correct, are you still based in Washington then, Alex?
Yeah, that's right. I'm still based out of DC.
Okay, very good. Lou, a little bit about your storied background.
Yeah, sure. And thanks for having us as well, George. Lou Crasto. I'm a senior director here at RSM, and I co-lead, as you mentioned, RSM Fund Services Plus. That's the practice that we launched that's centered around fund administration, and we'll get into some of what we do a little bit later on. I've been with the firm a couple of years now, but been in the alternative asset space for about 23 years now, spent about 10 and a half years as a former private equity CFO. I was CFO of a firm called Center Lane Partners for 6+ years. Also was the chief compliance officer there as well. I then made my way into fund administration back in 2015 when I joined a former colleague of mine from my days at Moore Capital, who had founded Carta Fund Services, a startup fund administration firm. After being at Carta for a couple of years, we were then acquired by a large global fund administration firm, Altodomus, and after a little bit of time there, I was eventually became head of private equity for North America for Altodomus. So, looking forward to the conversation today.
Yeah, well, thanks, and it's kind of fun to start a business, right? We did, and I think we did some good work with you, in the early days of getting the RSM, fund business off the ground, right? And if we could, I'd like, Lou, if you could spend just a couple minutes for our audience on just a brief overview of RSM, right? In today's SEC world, believe it or not, there's 540 named auditors. RSM is obviously right near the top 4, right? And that's certainly in the bottom rung of the top 10. But maybe for those that aren't that familiar with RSM, you could give us just a brief overview.
Yeah, sure. So RSM is the 6th largest accounting and professional services firm in the world. The firm's been around for over 100 years. We provide a wide range of services spanning audit, tax, and consulting. Our core strength is effectively serving the middle market. I know a lot of the conversation today will be talking about the private fund rule and hence registered investment advisors. And so we have a long and rich history serving private equity advisors and real estate advisors. And we serve them across the entire ecosystem, whether it's at the GP level, the fund level, or the asset level, portfolio company or real estate investment asset level. So, yeah, that's a little bit about the firm. And yeah, a lot to talk about in terms of certainly the private fund rule and what we're seeing and what we do, what we can do to help investment advisors.
Yeah, well, thank you. And it's interesting because, you guys have, do a lot more than just the age old assurance, tax and consulting, audit firm. And you guys, I think, have been probably a client of ours now for about 7 or 8 years. And it's been a great relationship with, a lot of folks, starting with John Waterman. And so you mentioned the private fund rule. And, obviously, as we near the end here of 2023, probably one of the largest SEC agendas I've seen in a long time in 2023, and that'll carry into 2024. Obviously, Alex, was hoping you could talk a little bit about the private fund advisor rule for our audience, maybe a bit of how we got there, and then a bit into kind of the advisor-led secondary rule, and even some of what we think some of the audit requirements mean for some of our listeners. So that overview, I think, would be terrific.
Yeah, and I love kind of setting the scene a little bit, kind of the how we got here, right? So if we kind of think about, we go back to the beginning of Chair Gensler's tenure at the SEC, we'll see that, he was really very vocal in his belief that over the past 5 to 10, even 15 years, we've seen this growth in the private fund space, right? Both in the number of assets as well as the complexity of the funds that are coming to market. And I think that these rules, coupled with the reforms the proposed reforms we've seen to Form PF, as well as the custody rule or the safeguarding rules, really can be viewed as a direct response to this kind of changing private fund landscape. So specifically, there's a few risks that we're specifically trying to address through this private fund advisor rulemaking, right? There was a perceived lack of transparency in the private fund space, some perceived conflicts of interest, as well as some perceived lack of governance mechanisms. And these rules are really meant to address those risks by increasing transparency, competition, and efficiency in the private fund market. I'll kind of let the viewers decide whether or not the SEC met or met those objectives with this rulemaking. I'm sure many of you are aware that a number of industry groups recently, I think it was within 10 days of the rule being adopted, they sued the SEC, saying they didn't have the legal jurisdiction to impose these rules in the private fund market. So we'll kind of see how that lawsuit plays out in the coming months. Hopefully, early 2024, we'll hear something Q1, Q2. Our suggestion in light of the pending litigation to funds is really to kind of move forward with the status quo, assuming nothing will change. We'll kind of see if any pieces of the legislation or the rule are thrown out, or maybe the whole rule gets thrown out. But you certainly don't want to be caught flat-footed come May or June if the courts decide to withhold or uphold the entire rule, and you look to see maybe you have 6-7 months to comply with some of these provisions. So it is, I think, still helpful to talk about what's in the rule, start thinking about your gap analysis, what you need to do operationally to prepare for the rule. So we can kind of jump into that part of the discussion now. Thinking very high level, I think there's been a lot of discussion on this rule, so I don't want to go into the weeds too much about what's in the rule, but just kind of setting the table a bit. There's really five new requirements for private funds, and then one new requirement that applies to all RIAs, regardless of whether or not they're managing private funds or not. So specifically, there's a new quarterly statement requirement for all funds managed by RIAs, a new audit requirement for funds managed by RIAs, and a new fairness opinion or valuation opinion requirement when an RIA leads in a secondary transaction. And then there's two requirements that apply to all advisors to private funds, both RIAs, ERAs, and any other non-registered advisor, right? And that includes restrictions on certain activities, which the commission believes are counter to investor protections. And there's also some prohibition on preferential terms without appropriate disclosure. And in some cases, the commission would require those preferential terms be afforded to all current investors. So a lot in that rule. Like I said, I don't want to jump into kind of all the specifics today. I think there's that ground has been covered, but really focus today on the questions we're hearing, kind of the operational challenges that you may face as you're looking to adopt this rule. And we can really start with that advisor-led secondary rule. And I think this weaves in well with the current economic dynamic. We're seeing a significant decrease in deal flow, both in the private equity space as well as the real estate space. And as a result, a lot of funds are looking to utilize continuation funds, where your legacy fund is reaching the end of its contractual life. You've got these illiquid assets. You don't really want to sell them in the current market, right? You don't want to take a hit on your assets. So you're looking to move those assets into a new vehicle, maybe move the LPs over with it. And that's the type of transaction I think that fits pretty squarely in the new advisor-led secondary transaction rule, right? So advisors who are going to be using continuation funds should really kind of start thinking about the time, the information that you'll need to really work with those investment bankers or the valuation specialists to ensure you can get those opinions in time and not delay a really necessary transaction. And more on the current front, right? We saw recent SEC enforcement action against an advisor came out in September related to the improper use of kind of a continuation fund. They essentially moved LP interests into a new vehicle and effectively locked up that capital for 10 years. So the SEC took issue with that use of the continuation fund.
Yeah.
There's some other issues included in that enforcement action, but certainly, something to think about it just in light of the current economic conditions.
Yeah, no, that the enforcement action, case, I guess, is interesting. And then Lou, when you think about this, there's obviously some new operational challenges, right, associated with the rule. And, maybe you could take us through, some of the more significant ones that you see.
Yeah. So the thing that jumps out at me just as a broad topic here is really a topic that really is present at every conference nowadays for CFOs, for private capital CFOs, and that's data management. We all know what's happened over the past 15 years in terms of, to Alex's point, right, the demands for transparency, right, the Dodd-Frank Act that required registration, the evolution of ILPA reporting for more transparency, and all of this, as we all know, is added to the burden of CFOs for real-time reporting and the capture of granular data. And so this private fund rule, it just takes this now to the next level. And when you think about what will need to be done now on a quarterly basis, whether it's the fund table or the portfolio investment table, that's now one more layer of tracking granular data. And oh, by the way, there's reporting requirements that go along with the new reporting requirements. And so more than ever now, right, asset managers, if they've not already, they really need to be thinking about how to build a scalable model or how to implement a scalable model for tracking this granular data. And so that's the first thing that jumps out at me. If you're a new manager, you've got one fund, okay, right? You can get by, but when you get to the point where you're managing multiple fund complexes, what happens is the legal entities proliferate. You're now not managing 3 entities. You're now managing 30, 50, 100 legal entities. And so there's firms already struggling with data management, even before this private fund rule, right? How are they reconciling their intercompany balances between the management company and the funds, right? And all of the other reporting that they're doing, ILPA reporting. This now just adds adds one more layer, and there's no going back, right? It's only going to be this much
more granular, more transparency.
Yeah.
It's interesting because it brings you to that whole discussion, right, Lou, of how much how to lever the third party administrator, right? And because it's hard to believe, right? Outsourcing kind of started with mutual funds, then made its way through the hedge fund world, but slowly but surely making its way through the closed end world, right? PE and real estate and VC. But there's still a ton of self-administered advisors and funds out there that are absolutely going to be challenged with this. And I think, the race out there are those administrators that can quickly solve these data problems for these firms, right?
Yeah, it's a great point, George, because on one hand, it's a challenge, right? It's an additional burden, and it's creating a problem for certain firms. But for certain firms, it'll create an opportunity, right? For the firms that have an integrated data platform, or for firms that can get ahead of this new rule and have a plan for capturing this data. It's going to create opportunities as well.
Yeah, and it kind of creates this whole new world of the progressive third party administrator who really can step up, the fintech world that supports those administrators, right? When you think about, take this into 24 a little bit, Lou, right? I mean, would you say when you think about the fund administration industry, right? Do you think the industry itself, in addition to the advisors, is struggling with data and staffing? Data management and staffing?
Yeah, look, I think those are probably two of the greatest challenges in the industry. I really can't stress enough about the issues the industry has had with staffing.
Right.
And the irony there is that private equity has played a significant role in that. Just given all of the M&A, there are so many firms now that are hesitant to add to staff, right? Because they don't want to negatively impact their margins. However, that's translated into poorly staffed engagements. That's translated into overburdened teams that then creates even more turnover and more instability on engagements. And so, and then on the data management side of the equation, we've seen firms that use third-party providers where even though they do have technology, it's not fully integrated, and they're not kind of doing everything from A to Z, right? Right. Just as an example, we see lots of firms out there still struggling to utilize technology to handle all the data, all the entities of a fund complex, right? They don't put into the technology, right, blockers and splitters and holding companies, and so right, they putting just main entities in there, and well, these asset managers still need to do reporting at those lower levels. And so I would say, George, those are the two issues. And really, the model that we've built at RSM, it was squarely focused on solving for those two challenges. Yeah. And so we're trying to do things differently. We recognize that the staffing model is really broken in the industry, and so
how are you? Tell our listeners a little bit. How are you thinking about delivering kind of that scalable staffing model?
Yeah, so great question. So for starters, we look at our utilization for our entire team very closely, right? We don't ever want to get past the 60 or 70% capacity for our team before planning to hire to bring in new hires, and so that's number one, right? Once you're at 110% capacity, you're already gone way too far, right?
Right.
And the second thing is and this is truly resonating in the marketplace. When we're talking to prospective clients, we want to introduce them to their team before they sign on the dotted line, right? Right. We feel that this is a long-term relationship, and I'd want to know who's my team, right? And so that's how we're approaching it, right? We introduce you to your team. You get to meet the team members. They, everybody likes to say we're an extension of your team. Well, what a leap of faith, if someone's going to tell you that, but you're not going to know anybody until long after you sign an engagement letter. So those are the two main things, right? You get to meet your team, and then again, we are constantly looking at our staff.
It's funny. I think that's important because in my days in fund admin, right, we never really wanted to have the best actors and actresses at the presentation, right? We wanted to have the people that were actually going to deal with that client day to day, right? 'Cause that's the people that they bought into, really, right? And
exactly.
All right. So moving from the private advisor role, I want to talk a little bit about the outsourcing, right, with you guys today, and maybe one of you guys for our audience before we get into it a little bit could just give a quick overview of everybody, your view on the outsourcing rule, what it is.
Yeah, excuse me. I guess I'll jump in just really quick. And, if we look at kind of the regulatory environment currently impacting RIAs, we've seen it almost seems like a push towards the need and the necessity to use more service providers, right? We talked about the private fund rule. There's this new quarterly statement requirement for those fund shops with, many funds, many investors. It's going to be more and more difficult for them to, prepare those quarterly statements, have the data management services in place, kind of do that in-house. So we're likely going to see a shift towards the additional use of fund admins. You see, the cybersecurity rule and kind of the added burdens associated with that likely pushes more people to using service providers in the cyberspace or the compliance space. There's so many aspects of running a fund and so many compliance burdens that it almost seems like a natural shift that more people are going to start using more outsourcing, using more third-party service providers, right? So it does feel like this rule is just a natural progression that the SEC has seen the increased use of service providers, and as a result, they likely just want to ensure that advisors are taking the appropriate steps to ensure that those service providers are appropriate to provide the services they've been engaged to do.
It's interesting because we would call this, and we were way in front of this for years, what we used to call this best fit, meaning are you picking a vendor who's a best fit for you? And, if you really think about it, right, it really does create some interesting discussions around a service provider industry that's not consolidating, right? There are 660 fund administrators, 540 auditors, 300 primes, 1,400 custodians, right? And those numbers have just gone up since we started Convergence 10 years ago. And what gets interesting is, I think what this changes for the service provider industry is the cost of entry and the ticket to get in is going to be a little different, I think, right? And I also think and I'd be interested in what you guys think. I also think it presents challenges to vendors and service providers who want to get into markets they're not in. So if you're say you're a service provider that only does hedge, right? Now all of a sudden you want to get into closed end, right? How does an advisor justify picking you, right? Or and I've heard good debates on it, right? But my opinion is, I think this rule will start to weed out kind of some of the weakest players in the industry, and I think it will create some level of probably long overdue consolidation, right? I mean, I think the business today is 80-20 anyway in all of those segments, right, of vendor segments. But, the people just hanging shingles all the time, right? And new providers, right? So curious, Alex, you were going to, one of the things I think would be good to hear is, some areas that you would view in terms of how do you assess a service provider or a vendor?
Yeah, I think the best fit concept is interesting because, there's going to be providers that probably do want to break into new areas. Like if you're a hedge admin and you want to get into closed-end fund or, the private equity space, it's going to take a lot more to explain to your customers how you can provide those services and how you have the expertise and the right people and what you've done to prepare to kind of move into that new space. So, it's an interesting idea. I think that there's still going to be room for people to jump into the new areas if they do want to kind of expand their service line. It's just going to be a lot more work in explaining to prospects how they can serve them. So it does feel like table stakes going forward. We're going to see any service provider kind of have their diligence packet ready for RIAs to say, here's how we can serve you. Here's everything you need to do from your kind of oversight and diligence perspective. There's going to be a lot more work from the service providers to really prepare for the rule and ensure that they can provide the services that they hope to. And I know, Lou, I'm sure, is thinking a lot about this and how our Fund Services Plus team can continue to grow and kind of.
And Lou, it's a good point because Lou, I was going to say if you could make a comment or two on that whole concept of co-sourcing, which I think starts to kind of get at this issue a little bit, right?
Yeah. The rule we just discussed regarding service providers, that actually is an interesting one in the sense that for larger firms, as they need to now scrutinize even further, their selection of service providers, the co-sourcing option has gained in popularity because what it actually does, among many things, is it actually gives the advisors full control of their data. And so, for an emerging manager with not a lot of data, there's less of a concern there, right? But if once you start to have multiple funds, once you start to have that proliferation of legal entities, once you start to have all of that history of investor transfers and cash flows and IRRs and investors and all of that, and you do that for over years. If you ever needed to switch from a provider, and you were relying fully on their data, that's something you have to just accept, right? But if you have your own technology license, you now have gained a lot more control in that equation, and so that is one reason why co-sourcing has sort of gained in popularity is in direct correlation to this rule, if you will.
Yeah, no, understood. All right, well, let's switch gears to 2024 a little bit, and Alex, maybe you could chat a little bit about some of the the top SEC examination priorities in your mind, right? Specific to advisors to private funds, right? I'm curious what you're thinking.
Yeah, and we were fortunate this year that the SEC's division of exams posted their exam priorities a little bit earlier than they usually do. So we saw them published back in October. A lot of perennial exam priorities that we see, year in, year out. Valuation is obviously going to be a focal point of the division of exams. Fee allocation is going to be a focal point. If I look back to my time at the SEC and working with the exams group, the types of valuation questions I was often asked about was whether or not a valuation model that was being applied by an advisor was consistent with their valuation policies. So, I've been talking to a lot of advisors, a lot of our clients, a lot of our prospects recently about ensuring that one, your valuation policies and procedures are adequately documented to kind of cover your entire portfolio. We oftentimes see a policy kind of specific to private equity. Maybe they don't touch on how they value the debt in their portfolio. So making sure that policy covers the entire portfolio. If you have equities, you have debt, you have warrants, whatever it is, making sure that it's really fulsome and covering everything. Those are the types of things exams is going to catch really quick and start poking a lot of questions on. So you want to make sure that you kind of have your bases covered from the get-go and make sure that your policies are designed. Everyone knows how to follow them. Everyone has them in front of them and are applying those policies when they're actually valuing the portfolio. So that's number one thing, is the recommendation to folks. And then the second item that is another perennial exam priority is just expense allocations. And this ties back to the private fund rule, where there's a restriction or a prohibition on non-pro rata allocation unless those allocations are fair and equitable. That's also just a current priority, is like making sure that you're achieving your fiduciary duty and not overcharging one fund you manage, shared expenses when it maybe should be allocated in a different way. So making sure that folks are thinking about their expense allocation process, again, documenting how they plan to allocate expenses among their products. And I think that the biggest challenge that my clients are facing relates to dead deal fees. With a flagship fund, you're planning to have co-investors invest alongside, but if that deal falls through, you don't get the capital in the co-invest vehicle. There's nothing to invest in. So how do you allocate those dead deal fees? That's going to be really key for people to focus on and think about in light of that private fund advisor rule. So those are the kind of the exam priorities, kind of tying them back to the recent rulemakings that I've been thinking about. And I think you can also kind of, it's a easy segue into the recent enforcement actions we've seen out of the SEC. It's something that advisors should be thinking about. Again, crossing your T's, dotting your I's, not forgetting about the small stuff. We've seen a number of kind of broken windows type enforcement cases over the past 12, 24 months. We've seen 2 rounds of custody rule violations that related to, in part, inappropriate ADV filing updates. So making sure that your ADVs file timely, your audited financial statements are distributed timely, and then if any updates need to be made to the ADV, you're updating them, because those are the types of things the SEC can identify really quickly, really easily using analytics. And we've seen time and again their willingness and ability to bring enforcement action.
Yeah, I recently saw that on the marketing rule side too, right?
Yeah. The marketing rule is interesting too, because, I think in the past, exams would come in, kind of check for new rule compliance, give some comments about how you can do better. And then if it happens again, that's when it goes to enforcement. This time we saw exams go in, check for compliance with the marketing rule. When there's deficiencies, they were going straight to enforcement, and enforcement was bringing cases right away this time. So I think part of that, it was just the amount of runway people had to prepare for the marketing rule.
Yeah.
I don't think that, exams enforcement was willing to kind of give them a second chance. So certainly something to think about with the new rules coming out, making sure you're prepared, going back to our discussion.
Yeah, I mean, listen, you make a good point. There's plenty of case study and precedent out there right now to learn from. I mean, I think of 2 very quick things that Convergence did that are still in their infancy in the market. One is we sell to CCOs an ADV analyzer product, where we actually look at the accuracy and the completeness, but more importantly, the consistency of your answers with the marketplace, right? Or marketplace practices, right? And then the other one we look at is fund expense practices. So we can look at the allocations people have to certain expense categories. So if you want to charge your client for Bloomberg terminals, we can tell you what % of advisors that are SEC registered do that. And is that a market practice, right? So there's tools out there, right? It's just that people need to, this culture of compliance, right? Let's just call it that, varies, right? Greatly, I find, still at a lot of advisors. So listen, I want to finish up with it's been a great conversation. I want to talk about 24, right? Lou and I were talking just before we got started about how the whole world tries to cram in what they should have done all year in the last 20 days of the year, right? So I want to talk about 24, and I want to start with just kind of headwinds. Like, what do you guys think you're up against in terms of the marketplace as we go into 24?
So maybe I'll jump in first here. So I'll just say, as an industry overall, right, fundraising has been certainly been down for the emerging managers. We've seen a decrease in platform investment activity in the recent quarter, due, I think, predominantly to the impacts of lending in the marketplace. We've seen private credit activity picking up. That's the market that is in front of us here today. We're optimistic about the future for sure. As it relates to just, what we do to support registered investment advisors. I think for 24, the private fund rule is front and center for us. There's a lot in it. I would say that I would encourage, all CFOs and CCOs to stay close to the rule. I would encourage them to rely on trusted advisors that are close to the rule, right? I think people are in this wait and see mode of, okay, what's going to happen with the litigation? Who's going to take a stance first on what the right presentation is for some of this new reporting? And so I would take a look at your advisors and make sure you've got folks that are at the forefront there, and they have a view on what best practices should be. So, and then for 24 and beyond, I think again it goes back to this concept of end to end data integration. It's the industry has been trying to get better at data integration for the past few years now, and we've made a lot of progress. Right, things like APIs, connecting systems, and Snowflake is a great platform out there. We're going to keep continuing to go in that direction. And one last point on the topic, just we talk to lots of managers, and when we talk to managers in the kind of 2 to say 5 to 10 billion range, they're asking the question, how, what should my future operating model look like as I try to build my business? And it's all about end-to-end data connectivity. So a lot to talk about there, but those are my quick thoughts on.
I think that's clearly the outlook, and the opportunity for some, and the headwind, right, for others. On the tailwind side, what do you think? What's the wind on your back for, as we get into 24?
From my perspective, again, I think we touched on this earlier, but for us, there's never been a time where firms could benefit from great advisory than today. So with all of these, new rulings and new requests, it just creates more opportunity for us as folks out there need trusted advisory.
Well, I go back to your co-sourcing comments, right? It's the perfect time, I think, for people to put their toe in the water with co-sourcing, right? It gives you an opportunity. And then I would think, Alex, on your side, the tailwind is just, this additional regulation, right? I think it's going to be an opportunity for, well-positioned providers, and probably, not an opportunity for those that are maybe not as well-positioned as others. Your thoughts on that?
No, I completely agree. And the SEC posted their regulatory agenda just, I think, last week for the fall. And, there's a lot more coming down the pike, right? There's so many rules that are still yet to be adopted: cyber, climate, the conflicts of interest. There's just predictive analytics. There's just so many regulations. So for service providers who are well read in those rules and have a good understanding of what was proposed, kind of see where maybe they're heading from an adoption perspective, are going to be well positioned to help kind of steer through that regulatory environment.
Yeah. Well, listen, this was great. I really want to thank you both for a great conversation. I want to thank you guys for being a great client. You've been a really good partner with Convergence, and want to thank our listeners, right? We just did our 33rd month in a row of these, right? And I want, everybody to have just a terrific holiday, and, look forward to seeing everybody, all of our listeners in 2024. So thank you, gentlemen, very much. It was a really good conversation.
And George, a quick thank you too. Thanks for the platform. Thanks for all of your insights, what you've done. Again, we spoke earlier, but working with you now, I think it's probably going on 8 years. What your data analytics have done in the industry are impressive, and just I know we rely on them on a daily basis. So just and you constantly are evolving, right? Constantly evolving, and it's yeah, it's been great working with you, and yeah, it's been incredibly valuable. So thank you.
Well, thank you. Right, it takes two to tango. We always like a firm with a great vision too, and we've been impressed with what you guys are doing. So thank you both, and have a great holiday. And I look forward to seeing you both soon. Okay.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks.